sponsored by the James Madison Council.
Welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Gal Beckerman. I'm an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm thrilled to be here today to talk with Danielle Kahneman and Cass Sunstein about their new book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. Hi, gentlemen.
Hello, good to see you.
So let's get right into it because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to ask first probably the most essential question to understanding this book and your work in it. Maybe Cass, you can take this first one, and Daniel, you can jump in. What is noise, and how does it get in the way of decision making? And if you can give us some of the wonderful examples that you have in the book to help us understand, that would be great.
Thank you for that. Noise is unwanted variability in judgment. So if you go to a doctor who says when she's, let's say, energetic and ready to go in the morning, let's do a ton of tests, I think you have a problem. And when she's tired, let's say at the end of the week and the end of the day, she says, go home. I don't think there's anything to worry about. That's not an egregious case of noise, but it is a case of noise. An egregious case of noise is whether you get, let's say, 5 years in jail as a sentence or a month in jail as a sentence, depends on a lottery who is the judge who's assigned to sentence you. Or noise is a case where you get hired with enthusiasm by a firm to which you've applied, and someone who's just like you doesn't get hired just because that's another person who, let's say, has a different noisy relationship to you compared to the first. So unwanted variability in judgment within ourselves is all over the place, and in systems it is rampant, and it is a pervasive source of error and inequality.
Now, isn't it, and Daniel, you can take this one, isn't it always true that there's going to be variability and inconsistency because we're human? How do you distinguish between the things that are systemic? So for example, one of your examples, you just mentioned it, if doctors are more likely to order cancer screenings for patients they see early in the morning than late in the afternoon. That seems to be something, once you figure out that that's the case, you can sort of, you can balance that. You can find a way to solve that problem. But then each doctor, comes to their work with their bias and their worldview. So that seems not so much a systemic thing, but just a question of subjectivity. How do you distinguish, what is the noise that can be sort of dealt with versus the noise that is just human beings being human? Daniel, do you want to answer that one? Or
there's going to be variability whenever there is judgment. And our statement on that is that wherever there is judgment, there is noise. And what's most important, there is more noise than you think, because the reason we wrote the book is that when you look at the judgments that people make, when they're fairly complex judgments, not when they're elementary. And by judgment, I mean they can't be computed. There is a reasonable answer, but no expectation of perfect agreement. You find more disagreement than expected. And it's, whether it's human or not, of course it's human, but that's no excuse. When you have a judicial system, you would want the judges who are part of the system to speak in one voice. The insurance company would like its underwriters to speak in one voice. And similarly, the hospital wants the physicians in the ER to speak in one voice, so that the individual who makes the judgment and the particular state of mind in which that individual is, if these are material, if these have an effect on the decision that is made, that is undesirable, that's unwanted, and this is the noise that we're talking about.
Right. Maybe you make a distinction in the book between occasion noise and system noise. Cass, can you explain what the difference is between those?
Yes. So occasion noise might be that when you're very excited and happy about something, you will say, I want to take the job, I want to buy the house, I want to go on the date. But when you are not so excited because, let's say, your favorite sports team lost or because the weather's terrible outside, you'll say, I shouldn't buy that house, or I shouldn't go on that date, or I shouldn't take that job. So occasion noise means that small features of the background often, like whether the Boston Red Sox won, which I think everyone should care greatly about, can affect your judgment about things that are unrelated to baseball, like what you're going to do with your life in the next month, or what your judgment is about something that really matters. So that's occasion noise.
Okay.
System noise is the noise that goes across systems when you may have, let's say, one doctor who's really great and orders a ton of tests and tends to overdiagnose, and another doctor who's also really great but tends to underdiagnose and is really worried about putting people through the ringer. So then a hospital, understood as a system, will have be noisy. If there's a lottery, who's the doctor who attends to you? Level noise is meaning a degree of severity on the part of one set of judges, hanging judges, and lenient judges who were very generous to criminal defendants. That can lead to great differences within the system of criminal justice. And this is pervasive in business with respect to hiring, promoting, recruiting, etc. And the problem of system noise is what principally concerns us, though occasion noise is really fun.
Right. I just want to remind viewers before I go on that you can ask questions in the Q&A function, and we're going to get to that in about 15 minutes. We'll take your questions. You're both sort of getting at this question that I have, but maybe just to kind of pin it a little bit more clearly on the wall. Why is consistency important? Why is it? And I guess more specifically, in what fields of our life are consistency important? Because I can also imagine, and we can get to this too, an extreme of consistency and uniformity. So in what areas of our life, and you've begun to mention the criminal justice system, maybe education, where do we really need to think about sussing out this problem of noise? Daniel, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Well, the answer is in professional judgments, when it's an organization that is making judgments, noise is truly undesirable. And this is true not only in the judicial system, in the medical system, it's true in the patent system, it's true in hiring, it's true in personnel evaluation. It is true actually in fingerprint reading because there is noise even there. And so the answer is wherever there is judgment, there is noise. Now, we do not mind diversity, and we welcome diversity. In many situations, we don't care. We want variability. We don't want all our book critics to agree. We don't want all our film critics to agree. We certainly want variability where creativity is required. And we want variability in the process of reaching a decision. So if you have a group reaching a judgment, a common judgment, we welcome diversity in that discussion, but we would want the conclusions to be, in general, not noisy. And that is true really when you speak about professional judgments. In most professional judgments, variability, system noise is going to be noxious.
Right. So let's get to the kind of solution part of this. Cass, I wonder if you can talk us through what is the notion of decision hygiene, and give us some examples of sort of how do we clean up the noise in these various fields.
Let's back into that, if we might. So the character in this particular play we haven't mentioned yet is Bias. And Bias is a little bit of the charismatic performer, the Taylor Swift of decision theory, whereas noise is and we won't name a very uncharismatic rock star that you've never heard of because they don't get attention. Bias is systematic departure from what's right, as in a scale that shows you as consistently heavier than you are. That's my scale. A noisy scale is one that is all over the place, that sometimes shows you as lighter than you are and sometimes as heavier than you are. Okay, with respect to decision hygiene, which is the set of remedies we have for the problem of noise, the good news is that decision hygiene helps with bias too. It tends to counteract bias as well as noise. And let's give a couple of examples. Decision hygiene is a way of kind of washing judgments so that it combats enemies that you may not be able to identify in advance. And one way to do that is to have guidelines. Guidelines. They cut noise dramatically, and if they're good guidelines, they'll cut bias too. So when a little kid is born in the United States, there's something called APGAR score. It's pretty simple. It's a guideline, and it cuts both noise and bias simultaneously. The second thing you can do is really simple, and it's intuitive, and in medicine we see it, which is ask for a second opinion and aggregate the two. Now, if you've got more than two to aggregate, that's better. So if you get a bunch of independent judgments and add them up, the majority of the average will be much less noisy than if you take each one as individually. And under reasonably pervasive circumstances, if you do that, you're going to cut bias as well.
I was interested in one of the sort of tools that you described. Daniel, can you talk about decomposing a decision? What does it mean to decompose a decision?
Well, an example would be, a very elementary example would be when you're hiring for a particular position. Then decomposing, if you're going to interview someone, decomposing would be first constructing a list of the attributes that you require for the job. And then in the interview, you would focus on each one of these attributes one at a time and independently of the other. And you would and you would delay your intuition. You would delay the global judgment about the person until you have covered all the attributes. Now, more generally, when you're facing a decision with multiple options, you can see any option as a candidate. And options have attributes that make them more or less desirable, and evaluating attributes one at a time and delaying global evaluation are recommended steps for options more generally, as well as for hiring candidates. And certainly, similarly for evaluating candidates or evaluating people, the performance of people, you would want the person doing this to be thinking of separate events, of separate attributes of performance, and not to jump to a global judgment.
Now, I'm wondering sort of what you see as the role of technology in solving some of these problems of noise, specifically when we think about kind of algorithmic judgment and sort of removing the human variability. First, let's talk about sort of the positives. Do you actually see some hope in technology's ability to reduce the noise? Cass?
Noticed in the last period that when one says something positive about algorithms, people tend not to smile or jump for joy. And when one says something negative about algorithms, people do tend to nod, not merely in assent, but in pleased assent. I'm going to take a risk here and say something positive about algorithms. The first thing that algorithms do is they eliminate noise. They don't cut noise, they eliminate it. It's like a scale that always spits out, if not the right answer, the same answer. So if you have an algorithm to predict, let's say, whether people are going to flee the jurisdiction if they get bail, or an algorithm to predict whether someone is going to be in a job in 3 years, it's going to give the same answer, whether it's in a good mood or in a bad mood, whether it's Tuesday or Thursday, it won't be in a mood, and there won't be any system noise. Now, I think the human mind does not get thrilled to hear that, but it should be a bit happier than it is, because cutting noise is other things being equal, a really good thing. It tends to cut error a lot. Think of a scale that's noisy, it's all over the place. The errors add up and cause total error in terms of joyfully misperceiving themselves as thin people and depressively misperceiving themselves as overweight people. Those are both errors and they add up. So algorithms do eliminate noise. And that's very good. They can also, compared to human beings, and I'm using the word can, not will, be less biased along any dimension that you care about. They might be less subject to cognitive biases, let's say like unrealistic optimism. They might also, and this is very much a work in progress, be less subject to other forms of bias, which are very familiar these days, let's say.
Okay. And if we could talk for a second about the flip side, I mean, there is, I imagine you can also imagine the extreme too of the sort of a dehumanizing process that can happen if people are just turned into numbers. Daniel?
Well, in general, people are not in favor of algorithms when they compete with humans. So there is a film that I recommend to everyone, by the way. It's called AlphaGo, and it's on Netflix, and it describes a competition between a program and the world champion, or one of the best world players in Go. And all of Korea was transfixed. And there was, on game 4, the human beat the machine. It was one of 5 games where the human prevailed. And the interesting thing is, everybody was joyous, including, by the way, the team that constructed the program. They were clearly thrilled to see the human defeat the machine. So we have a very strong prejudice against algorithms. They're going to be resisted. There's going to be a lot of resistance. And there's going to be very tricky rearrangements to be made where very good algorithms, there is going to be a temptation to replace judgment by algorithms, and sometimes it's going to be a good thing to do, and other times it's going to be a bad thing to do. And one thing that you know, it's going to be very complicated. And this is coming. Those kinds of decisions and those kinds of difficulties are coming. And clearly having algorithms replace humans is not problem-free. It's going to cause massive disruption as it occurs.
Right. I have a sort of a meta process question, which is with my book reviewer, my book review hat on, somebody who looks at books every day, lots and lots of them. What was it like to work collaboratively? How did that come about? I was sort of surprised and thrilled when I saw the 3 of your names, right? You're 2 of 3 authors of this book. Can you explain to me, I guess, maybe a little bit how it came about, but also what the process was of working together on this? Cass, you can go ahead.
I think I first became interested in noise about 7 years ago, I think. And then about 5 years ago, Olivier and I began collaborating on something that could become a book, but we didn't really believe that there would be a book. And then, let's see, 3 or 4 years ago now, Cass became clearly interested and seemed to be interested in joining us. And we were thrilled because as soon as we knew that Cass was on board, we knew that there was going to be a book because he is a force of nature, and he was going to make it happen. And the collaboration was, as collaborations are. We sometimes disagreed, we mostly agreed, and we found a good way of working together. In part by separating topics, and in part by joining forces and really working cooperatively on each chapter. And we had both forms of cooperation.
I'm curious where the disagreements were. I imagine the general concept of noise was one that you all we're on board with. But what's fascinating is to imagine sort of where you actually found misalignment.
Well, the disagreements were not so much on content, they were on the level on exposition. And how many readers are we going to lose when we go into technicalities, and how essential it is to have technicalities and to speak to an academic audience as well as the public audience. So that was a balance that we were constantly struggling with, each of us within himself, and frequently we disagreed on that, and eventually we reached consensus.
Great.
I think I can say to this.
Sorry, Cass, do you want to add something?
Yeah, we really had fun with the book, I should say. And the overwhelming experience of the collaboration, for me at least, was fun and joy and laughter. And part of the joy was Danny is the master of seeing problems in his own prose and analysis. And he's almost as good at seeing problems in his co-author's prose and analysis. So the constant 5 a.m. notes saying, I don't know why Danny, would write, hadn't seen until now the fundamental flaw. And then maybe at 5:28 a.m., he'd say, I think I might have a solution. And that didn't happen a little. And I'm not nearly as good at that as he is, but I'm pleased to say that toward the last stages, some parts of the book that were pervaded by detailed analysis of law and policy, it occurred to me late that no one's interested in this except for me. And so I cut them.
Got it. Well, let's get to, with our remaining time, let's get to some questions from the audience. One question that I'm interested to hear, if you guys did research on this specific point, but on the question of law enforcement, noise in the world of law enforcement, is there any insights that you were able to come to on those questions?
Yes. So that if it's not explicitly called out in the book, it's implicitly there. So the subject of randomness with respect to law enforcement is very much part of the background, and in some places the foreground of the book, where when you think about noise, you might think about racial discrimination, which isn't quite that, but it is certainly, if understood in a certain way, in the same family. And the fact that, and this does come up toward the end of the book, whether under a vague law people have an unfriendly encounter with the police, it's often like a lottery. As well as it having a racial and class dimension, there's a lottery, and that's a problem. And a big question is, what are we going to do about it?
Right. I have a question here. Somebody named Julie Staple. We are at a moment when a significant portion of the population is proud to make decisions based on no information at all. Can your analysis speak to that? Daniel, you want to take that one?
Not really. I don't think that we have very much to that issue. We are really focused on professional judgments and the judgments of professionals who do we assume that they do want to reach the correct decision. This is the assumption we're making. And we assume they want to use information. And noise happens in spite of their intentions to do a good job. When people prefer to be led by their emotions and are just as accepting of misinformation as of valid information, we have very little to say about that.
Right. Another question here. Noise sounds a lot like statistical quality control. How does your work differ from or go beyond? And then the questioner mentions Deming, Jurin, I think other social scientists. Is there something to that you're looking at things that are adjacent to statistical quality control? Daniel, you can answer that if you.
Yeah. Yes. The answer is absolutely.
Okay.
What we deal with is effectively quality control. That is, right. And the basic idea of decision hygiene is to achieve disciplined thinking and to discipline judgment, which is the essence of that is quality control. And it's a reduction of noise, by the way, in quality control, because when you eliminate noise, you can see bias and then you can correct bias. But eliminating noise by achieving some uniformity is actually an early step in quality control and an essential one.
We have a question about whether suggestions for readings for those interested in reducing and identifying and reducing noise. Do either of you have any good reading suggestions for people who want to dig deeper into this topic?
Well, there's a book called Noise that has some details about reducing noise. And that book, I'm pleased to be able to say, has a lot of footnotes that deal with particular areas. So if you're interested in recruitment and hiring, or if you're interested in medicine, something that we got keenly interested in, or if you're interested in law and policy, we have something like a bibliography that can be extracted from the footnotes.
Let me ask a question another question of my own here. I'm curious about bias training and sort of this whole world of which a lot of institutions have sort of taken on over the last year with a lot more intensity. How do you see that sort of converge or diverge from this world of identifying noise? I mean, that seems fairly subjective as opposed to kind of the systemic kind of thing that you're looking at. But is it a good development that institutions are making us more aware of things like our own bias with regards to this bigger question that you're looking at?
Oh, certainly, but the bias that we talk about in this context is a particular kind of bias. It's a bias against social groups or ethnic groups or genders, and those are not the cognitive biases. When we talk of controlling noise, we're talking mostly of the cognitive side, not about the emotional side, which is the one that's being tackled in bias training.
Right. Another question here. What happens when one of the noisy decisions is actually the correct judgment? So, and they give as an example the 2008 stock crash where the majority expert opinions were wrong. Can you speak to that, Cass? Yeah.
Well, if you have a scale and you weigh yourself 1,000 times, and one of the times it's right, that's a positive thing, but you'd be lucky to be able to figure it out. Maybe you have an accurate scale that can tell you about the noisy scale. The problem with a noisy system or a noisy individual, like an astrologer, who sometimes is right, is that it's very hard to identify in real time which of the assortment of judgments is the accurate one. And that's why decision hygiene is so crucial as a noise dampener that can typically get you closer to what's accurate.
Right. Okay, I'll ask one more just to kind of close us out here. Which as you look out on the various fields that you were examining where noise is a factor, I guess where is it most consequential, you think, in our world today that we figure out how to eliminate noise, or just most a question of sort of, if not life or death, but really could make an impact on the way people live? You can, Daniel, you can start.
Well, I mean, clearly there is noise in policy making. So, for example, you can see that different jurisdictions, different countries, different regions have different rules about COVID, and they're essentially the same situation. And that's noise, and it's not necessarily a good thing, although in this case, perhaps there is something to be learned from it. I would say the life and death is clearly medicine and law are obviously urgent problems. And in both of those, we would want to make rapid progress.
Right. Cass, do you want to add anything to that?
I'd say HSE, health, safety, and the environment, taking them as a unit would be the area number one for noise reduction and decision hygiene.
Right. Okay, well, thank you both. It's a fascinating book. I enjoyed reading it, and I think there are a lot of important lessons for how society can function better than it is. I appreciate you joining us. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.